stuff, and then we'll let. Okay, Bill, very good. For those of you who may not know, we started the Virtual Builders Group when COVID came along. So I think this is a picture of one of our first get-togethers. And unfortunately, with COVID, Toby and I have not been able to host the in-person builders group here at our house. So at least to keep people in the soldering smoke, so to speak, we sort of put this thing together. What we'll do today, just a couple of quick admin notes, and then we'll get to Bill, N2CQR, who is a home brewer extraordinaire. We've got a couple of door prizes, and once Bill's presentation is over, we'll sort of go into an informal thing with project updates, and then we'll just keep the channel open as long as people want to chit chat. We still have a couple of guests coming along. Alan, W2AEW, another prolific technician, and his YouTube channel is just absolutely amazing. If you want to learn basic electronics and even advanced electronics, his webpage is a great place to go to. He's a sales engineer for Tektronix. And most of you may remember Barry, K3EUI, who has already made a couple of presentations. He talked about the Nano VNA with us on this group, and he made a couple of presentations to the club during our monthly meetings as well. So he'll be back to talk about antennas and more interesting stuff. So more to follow on those. We're going to try and alternate between having a guest and then having a month where we dedicate ourselves to project updates and that type thing. So maybe another month or two before we bring in another guest. Just wanted to share a couple of homebrewing references with you. You'll find that homebrewers, a lot of homebrewers, and Bill will talk about this, but they sort of keep themselves towards the QRP community, because a lot of folks in the QRP community like to build their own stuff. So the QRP ARCI is a club that you can join, and they have a quarterly magazine, QRP Quarterly, and that's a great reference. I can't remember exactly how much it costs per year, but it's not all that expensive. And then I'm sure Bill will also acknowledge that the GQRP club in Great Britain has a wonderful volume called Sprat, comes out every couple of months, and really talks about homebrewing stuff. As a matter of fact, in the latest, I think the latest or the last issue of Sprat, Bill's partner, Pete, N4QW, had an article in there. So if you're looking for homebrewing kinds of stuff, these are two places that you might like to go to. And just as a matter of a little bit of self-aggrandizement, if you haven't seen QST magazine, here I'm patting myself on the back. That's okay. I had an article in the QST in the classic radio section about a scanner that I bought for Toby when we were brand new second lieutenants and married in our first Christmas, and I thought she would appreciate getting a radio instead of a diamond ring or anything like that. So, also, on the Air magazine, they asked me to do a build procedural article on taking a piece of lamp cord and making it into a 2-meter J-pole. When Becky W1BXY at ARRL asked me to do this at first, I said, that can't work. But sure enough, with a piece of lamp cord, you can make a 2-meter J-pole very easily, and it works actually pretty well. So you might take a look at that in the September-October issue of On the Air. So our guest today is Bill, N2CQR, who's now got maybe 240, at least 239 episodes, and now with his co-host Pete Giuliano and N2CQW. If you haven't seen their blog, SolderSmoke blogspot.com, I go to it. It's probably the first place I go in the morning to see what's new going on Bill's bench. And then he also has a monthly podcast that you can get audio only, or you can now also get it on YouTube and see Bill and Pete as they discuss what's going on. Just to give you a little bit of a prelude of what you might see from Bill, here's a a radio that he put together some time ago. And don't let this scare you. Oh, by the way, you can
Pretty
start
scary.
out. Yeah, you can start out small and work your way up to this, because the technical side of the hobby is really an interesting side, and I enjoy it a lot. And I know some of you may already, but if not, maybe hearing Bill today talk to you about this will generate some kind of interest. We do have some door prizes today. I've got. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Could you remind me again? What is that topography called when you use a circuit board that way? What's that technique again?
It's usually called Manhattan style construction.
Thank you.
Sometimes you can even do it less than that and do it dead bug style, which is entirely a different way of doing things too. But yeah, that's Manhattan style construction. I do have 2 copies of Bill's SolderSmoke book, Global Adventures in Wireless Electronics, that will let Bill choose the winners today, and we'll get those to the. It's a great book, and I think you'll enjoy that if you're one of the 2 lucky people. We'll then, after Bill, we'll talk about what folks are up to today, and I'm going to unshare and turn it over to Bill, and look forward to hearing from you, Bill. Go ahead.
All right, very good. Okay, thanks, Dino. I'm just going to get my slideshow here going. There we go. All right. Hey, first of all, Dino, thanks. Can you guys all see my slides? Give me a thumbs up.
Yeah, we're good, Bill.
Okay, good. All right. Thanks to Dino for the invitation, and congratulations to him on the QST cover plaque. I saw that. I also want to thank Dino for this gift file here with the smoke coming off the SolderSmoke. We have that on the SolderSmoke blog with thanks to Dino. Dino has been one of our most loyal and long-term listeners and viewers in the podcast and the blog. And it's always a pleasure for me to hear from him, not only because of his long involvement in ham radio, but we both used to jump out of airplanes. So there's a special bond there. Airborne, Dino. All right. But I was really pleased when he asked me to come by and talk about homebrew ham radio. So one of the things I was thinking about just sharing with you folks was, why should we homebrew? Why in this modern age where, look, I have a wristwatch that has a transceiver that can reach anywhere in the world, right? And so why are we building things like in the picture that Dino showed, this kind of scary, ugly, horrible looking thing that is an SSB transceiver? Why should we do that in this day and age? For me, the answer goes way back into the 1930s, into the early life of this gentleman, Gene Shepard, whose call sign back then was W9QWN. Shepard, his last call sign was K2ORS, but he used to have an AM broadcast radio show in New York on WOR. And Shepard used to come on and for like 2, sometimes 4 hours a night, just tell stories from his youth, from his days in the Army, and many of them had to do with his early involvement in ham radio. He was in Hammond, Indiana, and he fell in with a group of kids, teenagers, high school kids, who were interested in ham radio, which was sort of like the internet of the day. It was the new technology, and they all got into it, and there quickly became kind of a pecking order, kind of a hierarchy of technical abilities. And your place in that hierarchy depended on your technical homebrewing skill. All the stuff they used, they homebrewed. They scrounged around the radio markets in Chicago. One of their members actually built a very early television receiver. And Shep would tell these stories, and this was my introduction to ham radio. And so my introduction to ham radio was all about home brewing and technical ability and understanding. Shep was pretty uncompromising, and he was kind of, I would say, like a fanatical home brewer, and he would insist that home brew is the way that you become a real radio amateur and get the most out of it. So that's always been with me, and Shep's early influence. Every time I find myself, reaching for a store-bought rig like this that I've recently been using, I can almost hear Shepard saying, Oh, that's pathetic. You pathetic appliance operator. Why aren't you using homebrew gear? And that's an exaggeration. But listen, and you could say, hey, look, that is something that was valid during the 1930s. But what about today? And that brings us to something I wanted to tell you about. So on Thursday of this week, Dean KK4DAS, who's the president of Vienna Wireless Society, and I were invited to come over to speak to a local high school here in Northern Virginia and to talk to them about ham radio. Now, this is a very high-tech high school. These kids in the high school have actually designed, built, and had launched into space a CubeSat. Okay, this is pretty high-speed stuff. And so we're thinking about, wow, what could we possibly say to these kids to make them interested in the kind of, ham radio home brewing that this guy was involved in. Now we're fast forward to 2022. These kids are building CubeSats and are far more advanced technologically than we are, even after 40 or 50 years in ham radio. But the results were, I think, surprising. So with these high-tech and digital age kids, one of the things we wanted to do was to tell them about the benefits and joys of building simple ham gear. You might think that this was a tough sell. I mean, these kids had built CubeSats. They had amazing technical facilities there at their disposal. But to our surprise, it was not a tough sell. We started talking to them, and at one point, Dean said, look, he said, the way most people obtain their gear today, and he pulled out a credit card. He said, that's how they obtain it. And then I followed up and I said, yeah. And as a result, the emotional connection that people have with that gear is about the same as the emotional connection I have with this device. I didn't build this. This is my cell phone. It's for me, it's just an appliance. It's sort of at the same level as my refrigerator or the dishwasher. It's just another piece of gear. When it breaks, I'll get a new one, and that's it. So we talked to them about how when you build a piece of gear, you create a kind of an emotional bond between the item that you have crafted with your own hands. I also talked to them about something that Shepard always talked about, and that's the importance of understanding how your device works and understanding it sort of at the component level. Even if you're going into high technology, there's a benefit of having at least once built something in the low-tech area. We talked to the kids about how in this day and age, very often we will run into people who are electrical engineers who've never actually picked up a soldering iron and built something important that works. We also talked to them about what I would call the creative joy of making something yourself with your own hands and then using it to communicate with people around the world. These kids were really unaware of ham radio and about what we could do with the items that we create in our home workshops or in our makers group. So we showed them my book. Dino mentioned the book, and I talked to them a little bit about my personal involvement in ham radio, which is explained in the book. But the real kicker was we pulled out a homebrew receiver. This was a large group of kids at a club meeting. There was about 45 kids in the group, which was really surprising. They all could have been home or they all could have been in the library doing their homework, but they came to see us. And I had decided to bring with me something to show them, what do we mean by home brewing? So I brought this little homebrew receiver, and I told Dean before we left, I said, depending on how they respond, I might leave it with them and let them play with it. This is a working direct conversion receiver. And I even put a little block diagram up on top of it for them. It's so simple. An antenna goes into a little bandpass filter. There's one stage of RF amplification, a mixer, a VFO, an audio amplifier, and then your headphones. And with that, you are listening to the 40-meter band. I told them that I had been listening to this receiver earlier that day and had heard signals from New Zealand direct. You could actually see their eyes open wide when I told them that. And then I showed them the device and I warned them, I said, look, it's quite ugly. It's not nearly as pretty as something like this, but there's a kind of a beauty in the ugliness, I'd say, because it's something that I built with my own hands. When you look at the board, you could see where I made mistakes, where I put parts and took them off and put them back on. And they really got kind of into it. I told them that I had built the whole thing on a piece of wood that was originally intended for barbecuing, and it was sold to me at Harris Teeter. So that's a Harris Teeter board down there below. And the PC boards, it's all put together by Manhattan Construction. It's held together mostly by solder and super glue. The little box came out of a Galaxy 5 transceiver that is about as old as I am, but I liked it because the mechanism, the gears were right, just what I needed. So using that simple block diagram as a guide, I was able to put together a receiver that could directly receive signals from all around the world. There were no chips involved in here. So I also told them that the level of understanding that you'd have with a rig like this was quite high. I told them that if they built something like this, they could be able to explain absolutely every part on that receiver. What does it do? There were no mysterious black boxes. I told them, I said, quite honestly, no one can understand how a CPU in a computer these days works. Those CPUs have millions of transistors in that. That is way beyond the capability of the human mind to understand or trace out. Yet with a device like this, you could follow the signal flow through every single one of those components and know what it does. It's all discrete components. There are no chips. They're all individual transistors. So I was telling them about this. And you know, sometimes when you're talking to a group, you get a sense about whether you're connecting or not. And we went in there thinking this would be a tough sell. We thought that they'd be looking at their phones or doing their homework or staring off into the distance. No, the attention was quite focused. They were really intrigued by this. So I began to tell them a story that I thought they could relate to. The reason that the group I thought they could relate was because the group was about half female and half male. So there were a lot of young women in the group, a lot more than we would normally expect in a discussion of ham radio. Also, really because of where we are in Northern Virginia, the number, you could just look at the crowd and know that a very high percentage of them had families who traced their roots to South Asia. Okay. And I happened to have a story. The story I was going to tell was about a good friend of mine named Ashar Farhan, VU2ESE, who lives in Hyderabad, India. And one of the reasons we got involved in direct conversion receivers was because a few years ago, Farhan, whose picture I taped to the bottom of the board, there he is, and there he is here. There's Farhan sitting in my shack where I'm sitting right now. But Farhan, a few years ago, wrote up a story about a direct conversion receiver he built that was called the DC-40. The reason he built it was because his niece, who was in a EE program, came to him and said, Uncle Farhan, I need to build something for my program. What should we build? And he said, let's build a direct conversion receiver. I also thought that the kids could really relate to Farhan because he is a high-tech entrepreneur. He's an electrical engineer who actually made his fortune early on, I think, in voice over the internet software. So he lives in both worlds. He lives in the digital world and he lives in the analog world. Farhan also has built CubeSats. He builds CubeSats for the Indian Space Agency, right? I think as a volunteer. And he came up with a great quote, and I'll present the quote in detail in a minute. He said, look, why do we build something like this? Why build like this? He said, because we have opposable thumbs that let us grasp soldering irons, okay? When I told this to the kids, you could hear them say, yes, they got it. It's unbelievable. I included some links to stories about direct conversion receivers. There's Farhan. Actually, in the background, there's an even simpler receiver here. This is a transceiver I made that uses just 2 transistors, one on transmit, one on receive. And the one on receive is even simpler than a direct conversion receiver. It's a regen receiver. And Farhan got to listen to it. But look, here's the quote that I shared with them. And what was happening is while he was building this thing, another uncle walked in. And he said to them, he was looking at them while they were building the direct conversion receiver. He says, "Why do you want to build it? These things are available in the Dubai duty-free shop," asked Harish, an old friend, when he spotted us struggling over the DC-40 one evening. I didn't have an answer to this question, and considering the amount of work piled this quarter, it seemed to be a sensible thing to ask. I think this question is answered by all of us in different ways. My personal answer would be because we human beings are fundamentally tool builders. We have an opposable thumb that allows us to grip the soldering iron. For an engineer, and by the word engineer, I don't just mean those who have a degree, but anyone who applies technical knowledge to build things, the act of building a receiver is a fundamental proof of her competence and capability. It is much easier to put out a 1 watt signal than it is to receive a 1 watt signal. By simple definition of a good receiver, a simple definition of a good receiver is that a good receiver consistently, clearly receives only the intended signal. Such a definition hides a wide range of requirements. The receiver has to be sensitive enough to pick up the weakest signal imaginable clearly, selective enough to eliminate other signals only, and stable enough consistently. All right, I got to move this here. It said, for a ham or an engineer, building a usable receiver is a personal landmark. It establishes a personal competency to be able to understand the very fundamental operation of the radio and mastery over it. So that's what we were telling these kids, even though they are all got their eyes on, Harvard and Yale and Stanford EE programs, science programs. We told them it's worth the time to build something like this. The students love it. And Dean and I both, as a result, had a chance to reflect on why we do this. In answering my question that I had at the beginning, why home brew? I would say that the rewards are mostly personal and psychological, not financial. It's probably cheaper to buy stuff like this than it is to homebrew, okay? Appliances are probably cheaper, but they do not provide the satisfaction and personal psychological rewards provided by home brewing. So in our follow-up with the kids, I did leave them the receiver. They have it. God knows what they're doing with it. I hope they're getting it to work. I hope. But this is something that's going on now, both in Hyderabad and Northern Virginia. Farhan is doing it in Hyderabad, and we're thinking about doing it here in Northern Virginia. We're looking at opportunities to help young people build something that is both meaningful and understandable. And we think that the direct conversion receiver is about the sweet spot. You don't want to get too simple. We actually started, many of us, with something as simple as the Michigan Mighty Mite, which is a seven component RF oscillator transmitter. That's really kind of too simple. The direct conversion receiver is really something. If they built that, if they were to build a direct conversion receiver themselves, they would start out ahead of at least 90% of all radio amateurs who, frankly, have never built a receiver. Building a receiver is a real milestone. So we're going to help these kids, and hopefully in the spring, we're going to set up club sessions where we're going to go back and build stage by stage, group by group, direct conversion receivers and let them experience kind of the psychological, personal rewards of home brewing. Anyway, that was our story. That was the connection with the YLs. What I'd like to do now is just go through and maybe talk a little bit about some of the things that I've been working on, and then we can go back and talk about this and have questions a little bit later. I just was thinking about what can I share with you. Some of it's related to the direct conversion, some of it's not. Look, I'm building permeability tuned oscillators. There's mine. And this is the result of something that Farhan started. Farhan causes a lot of this stuff to be, he creates a lot of kind of interest when he designed something. So he designed a rig called the Daylight Again. It's a completely analog rig, completely analog. And he also noted that it's getting harder and harder to get good variable capacitors. So he went back to something called the permeability tuned oscillator. And really this is a coil with a brass screw that you screw in. And as you turn the screw, you change the frequency. So you don't have to worry about a variable capacitor. The other cool thing about it is the mounting part is 3D printed. So Dean KK4DAS took Farhan's file from Hyderabad, printed it out, and that's the permeability tuned oscillator. I have it here too, you can see it. And we're working on it. We're trying to get it as stable as we can. And this will probably eventually go into a version of the Daylight Again transceiver. But we also might use something similar in the direct conversion receiver that we built with the kids. Related to this, I've been fighting kind of a very tongue-in-cheek battle with my partner in the podcast, who is Pete Giuliano, N2CQR out there in California. Pete is a truly legendary homebrewer. He's a homebrew master. He's built more transceivers, SSB transceivers, than anybody. But it's safe to say that we disagree on VFOs. A lot of the disagreement is kind of contrived because we have to have something to talk about and argue about. Pete generally prefers digital VFOs built around an Arduino and an SI5351. Okay, they're more stable. They're easier to set up. They have glowing numerals. Pete prefers them. That's his prerogative. He's been doing this long enough. He knows more about analog LC. He's forgotten more about analog LC VFOs than I'll ever know. All right. So he's earned the right to work with SI5351s. I just don't like them because they include for me too many mysterious black boxes. I prefer analog VFOs made with coils and capacitors. So in one of my rigs, I'm using an old VFO that was pulled out of a Yaesu FT101. It's completely analog. It's just transistors and FETs. This one on the right over here is a VFO that was pulled out of a Hallicrafter's HT37 transmitter. The guy was supposed to just sell me the capacitor. He ended up selling me the whole VFO assembly, which was really nice. And I could change this to a VFO that'll go from 5 to 5.5 megahertz. This has led us to a discussion of how do you get the tuning on an analog VFO to be linear, and what kind of capacitors do you use? There are capacitors with funny shaped vanes, and I pulled this out of Thurman's book from the 1930s, and the different kinds of capacitors, because I think one of Pete's concerns is not only are the analog VFOs less stable, they have a tendency to be less linear in their tuning. In other words, for a given turn of the dial, you don't get the same amount of frequency change, which is something that we have to try to address. I've also been pulling off the shelf some old rigs. A lot of us who've been in this game for a while have old rigs that we built 20 or 30 years ago. And of course, you progress as a home brewer. So here's my very first superhet receiver called a bare bones superhet, designed by Doug DeMaw. And I built this one probably in 1997. Up above in this little box is my very first QRP transmitter that I built in 1993 in the Dominican Republic. And it was designed by W1VD of the ARRL. And this little power supply that powers both of them. And I just, for some reason, decided to pull these off the shelf and see if I can get them working. And, you know, Pete always says, when you know stuff, you can do stuff. And we progress as home brewers. And there were tricks that I picked up that made, when I looked at it, I said, gosh, why did I do that? I should have done it this way. Or no, the design is not quite right here. I should change it. And so I was able to get this working. And I was actually able to get it working probably better than it was when I first built it. Here's something else I wanted to mention to the group. And it's something I think it's worth doing every once in a while. And I call it working on the workbench. You know, it's worth it every once in a while to sit back and say, hey, let me look at my tools. Let me look at my test gear. Let me look at the setup that I have to build things. So here's my workbench over here. And there was a book that came out recently by Adam Savage, the guy who was in Mythbusters, that TV show. And it's about workshops and workbenches. Some of it's applicable to what we do. It's more of a kind of a craft, kind of a woodworking book, I would say, less of an electronics book. But he has ideas in it, and reading the book made me think about how I have my bench set up, what kinds of test equipment do I have, what do I need, what should I build, what should I change? And as a result of reading this book, I realized that I needed a better bench power supply. So I got this thing here. It's $40 on Amazon. It gives you a nice readout. It's tunable, it's changeable. I picked up some other stuff that I need, small stuff, big stuff, change the tools. It's worth it every once in a while to take a look at your workbench. Hey, the other thing I just wanted to mention, and Pete was teasing me about this in the last podcast, I have become a DXer. And it's only because back on the 11th of July, I put up an antenna up on the house. It's a hex beam. I got a hex beam because, cycle 25 is heating up and I wanted to have a good antenna for it. I used to have a Moxon up there, but a winter storm took it out and I don't feel like climbing up on the roof all that often anymore. So I put up the hex beam. Hopefully it'll stay up there and I won't have to climb up there anymore. But so I call this Hex DX, and I've been working a lot of DX, and people, kind of associate DXing these days with sort of appliance operating, but I say no. All the DX I'm working are using these two rigs. This rig down below is a dual bander. It covers 75 meters and 20 meters. I very rarely use 75 meters. I use 20 meters all the time. You could see peeking out of the dial there. That's the dial from an old Yaesu FT101 VFO. This one up here covers 17 and 12. Both of them were built on wooden chassis, and the boxes are made of the plywood from the packing material of pandemic era treadmills that we bought to try to stay in shape during the pandemic. I kept the plywood and used the plywood to make the cases. You could see that the cover on the speaker is actually the strainer for the kitchen sink. And this thing is something I found when I was out taking a walk. Somebody was throwing it out and I grabbed a piece of the screen and that became the cover for the speaker on this receiver. So yeah, I'm a DXer, but I'm a homebrew DXer. By the way, 93 countries so far using the hex beam since the 11th of July with all homebrew gear. So kind of fun. When I get to 100, I'm going to stop counting, but I'll go to 100. Hey, this is my kind of work, my kind of operating table. I'm facing it right now. You can see I'm facing the computer screen. That's what I'm talking about right now. But I have an old boat anchor here, a Hammerland HQ 101. And this, I guess this gets back to kind of going back to the old days of boat anchors. But I've had this thing since 1993. I picked it up in the Dominican Republic. It was seriously messed up. But I got it working and I got it working, I think, probably better than it was in the beginning. And I keep it on the table there just because I like to do some shortwave listening. I used it this morning to listen to the old military radio net on 75 meter AM on 3885. Great fun. And it's worth it. I keep it there. I like it. It's very simple. It's a 455 KC broadcast band, all frequency receiver. It's fun. And it was fun to work with. Listen, I just looking ahead and I want to open it up to questions, but I'm getting ready to set up a second shack back in the Dominican Republic. My wife is from the Dominican Republic and I lived there for 4 years, and we're going back at least for part of the year, at least for the cold winter months. We're going to be living at what I'm calling SolderSmoke Shack South. All right. And it is on the eastern tip of the island. Over here, a place near a place called Punta Cana, a little bit further south, like right in there. We've got an apartment, and they're going to build a room for me that'll be the shack. So my problem is I have to take like half of this junk with me down there. And I was telling Dino before that my problem is that every time I think I've removed half of this stuff, I look and it looks exactly the same as when I started. So my ability to reduce this junk by half, I don't know, it's kind of limited, but I've got some boxes set up and we will have a shack set up there. And my call sign, I've already been granted the call sign. I will be Hotel India 7 / N2CQR, which will be great fun. And I hope to talk to you from some place from down there. Hey, one other thing, one people ask, what can you do to help SolderSmoke? And I would say one thing you could do is just listen to the podcast, but now do it over YouTube because I'm trying to build up my hours. They want me to have 4,000 hours on YouTube. And we made a playlist with a lot of the old podcasts and a lot of the new ones. There's Pete Giuliano, N2CQR. Just go to the YouTube channel. There's the link. And just go to SolderSmoke on YouTube and check for the playlist of the podcast. There it is. But anyway, that's what I have, Dino. I'll keep these up here in case there are any questions. But that's maybe I'll just throw it open for questions and see if anybody wants to ask about anything I covered here today.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Bill. Really appreciate you taking the time to join us today. And I got a couple of questions I'll just start off with, maybe to get things going. How did you and Dean actually get into the school? The reason I ask that is we, over the years, have had, in 2014, we did an ARIS contact with a local middle school, which thank goodness was successful, oh, by the way. And there was a lot of interest generated. We taught some classes beforehand, and then we actually executed the contact with the astronaut as he flew overhead. But once that was over with, it was like, oops, the kids are so busy today that it's hard to get in there. And there are so many that you have to overcome to get into school. We tried with private institutions here, and you would have to go through background checks and all sorts of stuff. And frankly, to tell you the truth, it just became too hard for us. So if you have any tips on how to get to kids, we'd appreciate that. Of course, the homeschoolers is one way to go. We haven't made many inroads into that either. So if you could just let us know maybe how you went about that.
Okay, I mean, we were asked to come in, so that helped. They wanted us. They were looking for help in getting people licensed. So that was sort of the what got us in. One thing I would say is I think we kind of learned when we went there that the schools are under pressure to use the limited time availability during the school day. That's so that you really can't mess with the hours when the kids are in school. However, club time is a lot more flexible, and what happens in a club can be different. So I mean, you don't, there aren't that strict controls, so you could do pretty much whatever the club wants or whatever the club director wants. So that's how we got invited there. I hope it works out. I mean, Farhan is doing quite a bit of this in Hyderabad, and so I think we're going to help them get kids licensed. But then building the receiver that I described is a very different effort. It's, you know, the learning the license and getting licensed, that's one thing, but then saying, okay, now we're going to sit down and build a receiver, that's quite different. So I'm hoping that we're able to do that maybe in the spring, but we'll see how it goes. There are limits to what you could do, and the schools have to be careful, and that can make it difficult.
Sure. We here, of course, you probably know that Williamsburg is for the most part, is a retirement kind of area. So our club decided we would focus on the most likely people who might become hams, and those are folks who are either retired or some still working, have maybe the time and the disposable income to become hams. So that's where we focused on, but we're still in mind, still thinking about in with the kids.
Yeah, it can be difficult. Yep.
Yeah, I would tell you that my first ham receiver was an HQ 100A as well. It could about here across the street, and I have two Drake 2Bs as well down in the garage that are waiting for recapping. So
those Drake 2Bs, keep them going, Dino.
Yeah. Okay. Questions from the field here? Bill, you might want to go ahead and unshare your screen, and that way everybody could kind of see everybody. Yeah, that's probably a little better. So, questions? Anybody got questions?
Yeah,
Hey, Bill?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just wondering, how long has SolderSmoke been going? I've only discovered it in recent years here, and I love it. But
Well, Gary, I'm glad you're asked because we are one of the oldest of ham radio podcasts. We started in 2006. Can you believe it? This was before podcasting was really even cool or widespread. But it all started when I mentioned to a buddy of mine in Alaska, Mike KL0S. I told him about this thing called podcasting. We had been meeting on Echolink to talk about homebrew radio, and he was really intrigued by it. So the next time we met and we were talking about homebrew radio, he hit the record button, and that became SolderSmoke 1. And that was in 2006. I was in London and he was in Juneau, Alaska. So, and we have all the episodes. We're up, as Dino said, we're up to episode number 240. All of them are available. So, and we occasionally have people who say, I found it, I liked it, and I've gone back to the very beginning. And then they'll send us emails about something that we were involved in, in 2009. And I'm thinking, well, I got to go refresh my memory on that one.
Yeah, I've got a complete set from number 1 all here on my hard drive, and also the notes that went along with everything, so I could search through if I was looking for something specific.
Thank you, Dean. I'm glad you do.
Wally, I think you had a question.
Yeah. First of all, thanks very much for coming here. I see you had 240 episodes, but it wasn't until Dino put out the link that I got a chance to see a few of them. They're very interesting. I would be very interested in finding out. I think Dino did this once before, but I looked at your workbench. Could you make a suggestion as to sort of the bare bones minimum someone would need to go about not necessarily fixing some of the new digital transceiver or anything, but some of the older bone anchor stuff, oscilloscopes, what the specs might be, or, I mean, we're not talking about Roden Schwartz, of course, but, something that we could.
Yeah, I think, I mean, one of the great things about being a ham home brewer today is that there is a lot of really good test equipment available really cheap, frankly. And so, I mean, I obviously you needed, I would start with something like a digital multimeter and a good soldering station. That's really important. And then after that, I mean, I think we all very quickly become very dependent on the oscilloscope. The oscilloscope really is the main tool that we look at to see what's happening inside a piece of gear. And you can get a really good oscilloscope probably in the area of $300 brand new. I mean, I really wouldn't mess with some of the older stuff that's out there because they're very hard to keep going. I had an old 10-tech 465 that I loved, but it's a complicated beast and they're getting on and they break a lot. And once they break, it's hard to get them fixed. The Regal scope, for example, is a digital scope, $300. It really doesn't break. It sits there. It does everything you need. So that's good. And then some form of signal generator is also very useful. You can get little, useful signal generators from China. You can get them on Amazon for 40 or 50 bucks. And this, once you have a signal generator and an oscilloscope, digital multimeter, you're almost all the way there, and you could do a lot of stuff with that. The other thing we tell people if they're going to get started in home brewing or repairing stuff, start out small. I mean, don't make a really complicated project your first project. Start small. Start with something like a direct conversion receiver. And also, it's very important to look, when you look at a schematic or a project, don't look at it as a mass of components that are on a board. You have to try to visualize it as sub-circuits. Okay, part of that circuitry that you see on the schematic is the input filter. Part of it is the RF amplifier. Part of it is the mixer. Part of it is the audio amplifier. Part of it is the VFO. And you have to divide in your mind each one of those elements. When you build or you try to troubleshoot, ask yourself, is that part working? Is this part working? Try to find the part that's not working before you just look at it and say, oh my gosh, I built this thing and it doesn't work. So it's important to kind of break them down by function, but it's good to have a good set of test gear. So I hope that answers your question there, Wally.
Yeah, it does. Thank you much.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, I made a presentation to the club at least once, I think, about low-cost test equipment that you can get on eBay And it actually was a presentation to the 4 Days in May get together a couple of years ago, and it's up on YouTube. So I'll put a link out to folks, but you can go to YouTube, you can go to Amazon, like Bill said, and just about outfit yourself with enough basic test equipment to do some reasonable fixing and designing of some circuits. As Bill has said many times in the past, sometimes just taking something apart to figure out how it works, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to get it all back together again. But taking something apart to see how it all works and how it all intertwines together. Getting into boat anchor repair might not be the best first thing to do, but I'm sure Bill will agree that if you do that and you're successful, you really do learn a lot about the basics. I know Gary's a prolific home brewer, and we'll show some pictures of some work he's done on his thing. Gary, do you have any recommendation?
Well, yeah, just like Bill said, keep it simple. I mean, I've got a DVM, a soldering station from the early 80s, and I do disagree. I've got an old Tektronix 465 scope, and then those things are so reliable. Cost me $150 on eBay back about 20 years ago, and it's still working just fine. I just picked up an HP 8640 B signal generator for $75 from a local guy here. Had to fix a little mechanical problem in there. That's working great. That's about all I'm using. That's my whole shack.
I have the HP 8640 sitting right over there. It's a beautiful piece of gear.
It's
And
wonderful.
don't get me wrong, Gary, I love the 465 scope. It's just this, when I opened it up, when it started developing problems, it had all these plug-in transistors. I know not all of them do. Mine had plug-in transistors. And if you just brushed your arm against it, you could knock off 2 or 3 of these transistors, and then you weren't sure how you're going to put them back in.
Yeah.
It was really scary. The other thing was scary about the Tech 465. It's got a lot of really high voltage in there. It's got 4,000 volts in there.
Oh, yeah.
You know, Dino mentioned Alan Walke. Alan's a friend of mine. And when I was asking Alan about working on the Tech 465, he told me, he said, you need a high voltage probe. He said, you can't just go in there with the regular old multimeter. You need a high voltage probe. He said, I'll lend you one. It was scary looking. I got this thing in a box and I opened it up and I said, wow, you could really blow yourself up with that Tech 465. And sadly, that's when I switched to the Regal.
Another comment on that. I know the Tektronix and other HP stuff I've ever seen, they have a calibration tab on them. So it kind of makes me think, when you get one, whether it's eBay or wherever, how well is it? How accurate is it? And when was the last time it was calibrated? That's not something that I would be able to do.
Yeah.
So the Rego, for example, are they pretty much one set, they stay calibrated? Are they pretty much reliable?
Yeah, I don't think I've ever messed with the calibration on the Regal. I mean, they have a little calibration thing on the front where you could take a look and it'll send out like 1 volt square wave, and you could see, is it reading 1 volt square wave? Yeah, you're good. Okay. So it's pretty reliable equipment, and it's pretty amazing stuff for $300. I mean,
For the
I
most
think,
part,
Wally, if you're not trying to really measure with the device, like exactly the voltage or the timing super accurately, it doesn't matter if it is calibrated or not. I think that is only getting relevant if you're using it professionally. But yeah, if it is off by 1/10 of a volt, so what?
yeah,
Yeah,
that's
and
right.
actually they don't drift that much over time. Mine has a sticker on it from 1985, I think, and it's still really good enough for me.
I want to just follow up on something that Gary said about the HP 8640, and it just shows you a little bit about how the worldwide network kicks in. The 8640 was produced in the mid 70s, I think. And a lot of it was produced to test Cold War military gear. So there's a lot of this stuff floating around. But one of the weak parts of it was that it has a lot of plastic gears inside, and the plastic gears can fall apart. And if the plastic gear falls apart, you've got this beautiful piece of equipment that you can't use. There's a guy in India who's making replacement gears out of brass. He's actually pouring them, and you get and for $50, he'll send you a complete set of replacement gears for the 8640. I have them. I'm ready to go, man. When those gears go on mine, I've got the gears. I'm ready to go. But it just shows you there's this kind of worldwide network. People will identify kind of a really niche need and make something that helps you correct it. So I like that.
Yeah, and what's really good nowadays, we have the internet. I learned about those brass gears before I bought mine, and fortunately, mine has good gears. They're not broken yet. But
one other story
everything
about
I knew,
Yeah.
I knew all about it before I even bought the thing. So
this is the thing. When I was a kid, before the internet, there was nobody you could turn to with these kind of questions.
yeah.
With the 8640, all of a sudden I noticed that my counter wasn't working anymore on the 8640. And so before I even opened it up, I asked people and they said, you've probably lost a tine, which is one of these little forks, tiny little thing. I mean, it's maybe 2 or 3 millimeters wide. They fall off. And I said, nah, that can't be. And I opened it up. And when I turned it over, just out of the corner of my eye, I saw something fall out. It was the tine. The same video had instructions on how to use JB Weld or super glue to put the tine back in there where it was supposed to be. And I did it. I got to say, it was one of the most satisfying fixes that I ever did, just because it was just this big piece of gear and there's this tiny little tine, like a fork, like one of the things on a fork broke off. So yeah, there's a lot of information, a lot of resources out there for the home brewer today.
Yeah, the 460, I have a 465M here in the shack that I got, and it's the military version of the 465. It's quite different from a regular 465. And when I first got it and turned it on, I said, oh no, the fan isn't working. I need to take this thing apart and see what's the matter with the fan. I took it apart. I couldn't find the fan because there isn't a fan. There's a huge heat sink on the back of a 465M because they built it to go into, ships and wherever. They didn't want to have to worry about the fan. So they designed it so that it would keep cool regardless of not having a fan. So that's a nice scope. And
one more thing about the 465 and the switch to more modern scopes. I like to point out that 2 really respected homebrewers, Wes Hayward, W7ZOI, who used to work in Beaverton with TAG, had a 465. Now he has a Regal scope. Farhan in Hyderabad for years had a 465. Now he has a Regal scope. So this may be the shape of things to come. I don't want to talk bad about the 465, but man, the Regal scopes, they're hard to beat.
there are some things where an analog scope, though, will give you a better representation.
Yeah, sure.
Probably not enough to make you choose that way, but
yeah.
anyway. So there are a lot of inexpensive pieces of test equipment. As Bill said, start out with a digital multimeter. You can get them cheap, and see how much voltage your car battery is putting out. I mean, I'm going to go to the low end of the spectrum here, but if you do that and it's low, you now have troubleshooted your car, and you need to do something about it. So other questions from the field?
Yeah, I wanna know how you choose your projects. I'm really always interested in that because, yeah, as you said, the internet, there are like thousands of projects, ideas out there.
Yeah, it's a good question there, Moritz. I think Pete and I have kind of come to the decision about what we're going to focus on building. We prefer phone gear to CW, although both of us started out as CW operators many years ago and spent many years with CW. Lately, for one reason or another, we're more interested in phone gear. We're more interested in HF than VHF or UHF. Not saying anything bad about VHF or UHF, it's just that we prefer HF. And so what we've kind of gravitated towards building mostly is SSB HF transceivers. SSB HF transceivers. I mean, Pete has built, I think, 30 or 40 of them. I've built a fewer in number, but that's kind of the area that we operate in. And we look at different ways to handle different parts of the circuitry, how to make a better VFO, how to make a better amplifier, what overall architecture you're going to use, how many bilateral amplifiers you're going to use, things like that. So this has been enough to keep us kind of interested and busy for a long time, but that's where we focus. Other people focus in different areas. Some guys are very interested in CW, they'll build CW gear. Thing we always say is, look, it's a hobby, it's for fun. So whatever you enjoy building, that's probably what you should build.
Yeah, thank you.
The other thing for folks who are just getting into this, there is nothing that exceeds the feeling of accomplishment when something that you've put together, not necessarily from scratch, it could even be a kit. And I would recommend folks start out with kits before they start breadboarding and Manhattan building stuff. But there's nothing that exceeds the achievement of the feeling that you get when you build something and it works. So the first direct conversion receiver I built in high school in our electronics class was, hey, I plugged it in and my goodness, the thing worked. What a feeling of accomplishment.
Yeah.
We like to try to tell folks, Bill, that feeling of accomplishment, if you're a golfer, I could take a golf ball and walk up onto the green and drop it into the hole. I don't need to start 600 yards back there, do I? It's just that feeling of accomplishment that you can get from doing it yourself. So
yeah, and there's a hierarchy. It's kind of, in certain sense, it goes back to kind of the hierarchy of adolescence. But when you have gear that you built yourself, and you and the other guy asks you when you're talking on the radio, what equipment are you using, and you say, well, I'm using a homebrew transceiver. Sometimes there's this kind of stunned silence from the other side. Some people respond very well. Some people get very kind of jealous and envious, and they'll come up with, well, yes, well, I suppose it sounds okay for a homebrew radio.
or you're 50 hertz off.
We just kind of grin and bear it at that point. But it does create kind of a sense of pride and satisfaction that you get when you're using stuff that you built yourself to communicate with people on the other side of the world. There's no doubt about it.
I've heard you talk about the QSOs that you've had with your homebrew rigs, and the person on the other end will say, well, you're 50 hertz off.
You're 50 hertz off. Or I would do that if I wasn't neglecting my family the way you obviously are. Things like that.
Okay. What else? Anybody else have questions? I know we have some beginners here. It might be some beginner questions. If Toby, you're muted, go ahead.
I just want to make one comment. So I'm a novice to kit building. I've got Gill's K4JST's radio. I haven't started on any, but I bought a kit to participate in the QSO Today this last weekend. One of the events was a kit building. You would watch the gentleman build the kit, and you could build simultaneously, but I decided not to start building it. But Dino ran me through the whole thing about it, and this is where the light comes on, and it's pretty exciting. We went through the resistors so I could figure out what all the resistors were, and he even had something from his high school days. It was a little cardboard thing, and you looked at the resistor through a magnifying glass, saw the different color bands, and then you took this little card and figured out what the voltage was. And then he showed me the meters that he also uses. But I was really excited to be able to figure out the voltage, the resistance, and it was really pretty exciting. So people who haven't done that yet, I think it's fun.
Yeah, it's great. And all this, it builds your skill. It builds, you come away thinking, okay, I'm a better builder than when I started. I learned something as part of this process. I remember when I first built the first receivers that I built in the Dominican Republic, when I finished building them, my hands were physically tired. But it was a good kind of fatigue, because I realized that I was developing manual skills that I hadn't developed before. So it was a good thing that my hands were tired. The muscles in my hands were kind of worn out. And it's the same thing when you learn new skills that you could build things, build on it. Yeah.
Yeah, Gary might recognize this. You might have, Truman Horton might have given you one of these, Gary, the old Ohmite, how to figure out what a resistor color coded. This is from high school 53 years ago, but I still have it at the workbench because I never really got it burned into my brain what the colors were. And every once in a while, I'll have to spin the dial here to see what a resistor is. But
Yeah, I still have two of those on my bench, I didn't get them from Horton, but I got them from my dad, I think.
yeah, Gary and I were very fortunate. Our electronic shop instructor was Truman Horton, WB6QFEs, now unfortunately a silent key. But he shepherded our ham radio club there in electronic shop. The year before he arrived, the guy who ran the wood and metal shop was in charge of the electronic shop. So if you'd go up to him and ask him a question about what was going on. There was another sort of like student aide. His dad had the radio TV repair shop in town, and he was sort of like the student aide, and his name was Mario. And so you'd go up to Mr. He's probably gone by now, so I don't mind saying his name. His name was Mr. Flynn. And Mr. Flynn, could you explain this resistor thing? And the first thing out of his mouth would be, Mario, Mario. And then thank goodness Truman showed up the next year and took care of us. So
Yeah,
Uh,
Dino's
what-
a couple years younger than me. When I took the first class, the electronic shop was run by the football coach. He was basically just a babysitter. But we had this old lab that they used to have a teacher there, and it was full of parts. And we were able to just build anything you want. So I built my 9TO that really gave me good CW operation this whole time. I still got it on my shack table, or I still use it.
Good.
So,
My son Rodney, when he was going to high school, he got a summer job at the Naval Surface Warfare Center. And his first job was to go through these big boxes full of resistors. He had to sort them. And I gave him that same slide device you have with the wheels. And he took it to work with him. And his supervisor was amazed at how fast he went through them. So when he saw how he was doing, he said, "Oh, that's not fair." So he took it from him. And so I told Rodney, I said, "Well, you write this down on a piece of paper." But this is how I remembered it. It was bad boys race our young girls, but Violet goes willingly. And that's what I still remember to this day for all the colors.
I was afraid you were going to say that.
Yeah.
I fixed it up though.
It's been fixed up. Yeah.
Yeah.
A bit. Yeah. One thing I would say about this whole thing, that one thing that's important to remember as you start, and this is something that took me a long time to understand, those schematics that you find in the books and the magazines, they're often wrong. There are mistakes in there. All right. They're written by fallible human beings who are often amateurs just like us. So some of the stuff that I tried to build when I was a teenager, I just couldn't get it to work. And my assumption was, well, I have done something wrong. Years later, I find that there was an error in the schematic. Errors in schematics are really, really common. Probably a lot more common than you'd expect. So this gets to the importance of understanding. If you understand the circuit and you look at the schematic and you say, wait a second, that can't be right. It probably isn't, right? So it's really surprising how often you'll find errors in schematics. I mean, I think in a book like Experimental Methods for RF Design, which is really one of the authorities in this whole thing, there is a very, very extensive errata section where they've gone back and said, okay, this was not right, that was not right. It's understandable because this is very technical stuff. It's easy to get a mistake in a schematic and not catch it. And it's really hard to find editors who are competent enough to see that. I mean, if you're writing a romance novel, somebody can check your text, right? That's pretty easy. If you're writing a book about how to build an SSB transceiver, it's hard to find somebody who's going to catch errors. It's hard.
I built one of Doug DeMau's crystal testers years ago. And if you looked at the schematic, there was a resistor that didn't have a value associated with it. Doug was gone by then. So I just looked at the circuit and I said, doesn't really matter all that much. 1K, 10K, it's going to do the same thing.
That's right.
But if you're planning on building things like out of QST, you might want to wait a month or go to the they have a page there on the ARRL website that has more information about your project, and you'll find errata there as well. So
Yeah.
Anyway, other questions? Anybody else? All right, well, I guess it's time to give away a couple of the door prizes. We have 2 of Bill's books, and let's see, we have 14 participants. So we're going to take Toby and I out of it because we already have Bill's book. So Bill, if you would pick a random number, and Toby has written down everybody's name next to a number. And Bill, if you would pick one random number between 1 and 12.
I'm going with 7, Dino, 7.
And who might that be, Toby?
This must be first timers luck because it's Gary WB6 OGD.
All right.
Oh,
All right, Gary, we'll get that in the mail to you here soon. And
thank you.
yeah, one more number between 1 and 12, not 7.
Okay, I'll say 2.
2.
Okay, Robert N1PAX, and the exciting news there is Robert became a ham maybe a couple years ago. His son became a ham, and recently, I think during field day, his wife became a ham.
So
So
whole
it'll-
ham family now.
Yeah, it'll be a good book.
I hope you guys like the books.
All right. Last call for any questions for Bill. All right, Bill, thank you so much for coming. You're more than welcome to stick around for the chit chat, but you probably got other stuff to do. But you're, like I said, you're more than welcome to.
I just got text messages. I'm being summoned to lunch.
Okay.
So off I go. Hey, but listen, Dino, thanks very much. Toby, thanks. Thanks to all the members of the club. Thanks for having me. And I really enjoyed talking to you. Anybody has any questions, shoot me an email. Dino knows how to get in touch with me all the time. And I hope you have great fun in ham radio, as much fun as I've had.
Okay, and Bill has been recording this session and he's going to put it up on his YouTube channel. So you may want to stop recording at some point.
There we go. I'm going to stop right now.